Autism evaluation process for an adult.
Hi, I'm Brett, the Audi Boss. I'm an autistic leader with ADHD. I've been a manager and in a leadership position for over 10 years in a corporate job. On this channel, I talk specifically about ADHD and autism in the corporate workplace. In this video, I'm going to walk through my experience getting my autism evaluation, the assessment process from start to finish.
I'm about to turn 44 years old. I got my late diagnosis just before I turned 41, so I was 40 at the time of my late diagnosis. I had already sort of been going through the process of trying to get an ADHD diagnosis at that point. A friend of mine was already seeing an ADHD-focused therapist at that time, and through the conversations that my friend was having with their therapist, I was starting to recognize a lot of things in myself for ADHD. There was a long questionnaire that their therapist gave me at that time that I could go through to assess myself. And in the process of doing that, it was something like 200 questions, and it was kind of a scoring sheet that, based on that assessment sheet, determined whether or not, you might be a candidate for ADHD. And as I was looking at all these questions, going through that process of, oh wow, is that ADHD? Is that ADHD? Is that ADHD? So the more I went through that process and discovered, wow, this is ADHD, I feel like I need to have more of a formal diagnosis and have a better understanding of what ADHD looked like. At that time, I didn't know there were 3 different types of ADHD that were diagnosed, attentive, inattentive, and the combined type. So at that time, I was starting to look for someone who could give me a formal diagnosis for ADHD, or a therapist that could help me with that ADHD. And about that time, looking for more of those resources online led me to the connection between ADHD and autism. And as I was looking at the connection between ADHD and autism and the similarities that were happening there, I started to wonder if I had autism. And more of the things that were jumping out for me in terms of the different areas of autism, I felt strongly at that point that I needed to get myself a formal diagnosis and look into a formal diagnosis for ADHD and autism. Now, a lot of people do self-diagnose. There are a tremendous amount of resources that can help you self-diagnose from legitimate organizations that can help you get to a place with self-diagnosis for ADHD and autism, and those things are valid. In my opinion, those things are valid because with insurance being very expensive, an ADHD and autism diagnosis, in particular an autism diagnosis, can be very expensive if you don't have insurance. And so because of that, for an adult, that self-diagnosis can be very valid. I felt I needed a formal diagnosis. That was just a decision for me. It was something that I felt I really needed. There were areas where I really struggled in both my job and just in areas that as I went further down the pathway of what autism is and what it was looking like for me, areas where I had real struggles, I felt I needed support by having a formal diagnosis, and so I started to look into how I could get a formal diagnosis. I had been using the resource Embrace Autism. Incredible resource full of research, blogs, tests, things that you can do for yourself. There is a section specifically on autism assessments where they will break down for you what the autism assessment process is. You can use Embrace Autism. You can go to them for a formal diagnosis. This is not a paid endorsement. I am just a fan of their work and a fan of their resource and a fan of their research and a fan of how accessible their things are. I did do the first part of the diagnosis process with them because I could not find at that time someone who could see me in under a year for my diagnosis process. So I started the process with Embrace Autism. There are a series of tests. There are a series of things that you go through to sort of get things started. In my experience with them at that time, they gave me very specific instructions. There was a very detailed questionnaire that was specifically asking for different life examples and things like that. There were a series of tests that they gave me to specifically test. Again, those things are outlined on their website. A breakdown of different parts of the evaluation process for you to decide for yourself how much of an investment of time and how much can you afford in terms of the different parts on Embrace Autism's evaluation process. I started that process and paid for the first portion of the assessment because, again, at that time, I could not find a psychiatrist who could diagnose me in terms of in my area that had the bandwidth. And this was, again, in the middle of the pandemic, so it was really hard to sort of get a meeting with somebody. I also was meeting with my insurance company regularly to try to find somebody. I was asking for them specifically to help me. I was rather meticulous about how I wanted to go about researching who I was going to for an assessment. I wanted to make sure that I was looking for someone who had the most up-to-date research and information on autism and ADHD. So there's been a lot of research in the last 10, 15 years specifically around autism, and in particular around autism in women. And I wanted to make sure that the person that I met with was up to date on the most recent research, certainly at least within the last 5 years or so for that research. So for me, that was incredibly important. That was an entry point for who I met with. There were people who had long waiting lists. My experience was I had to find a psychiatrist based on the information that I was given at that time for my evaluation was I needed a psychiatrist who could meet with me. So I started putting feelers out. I started calling a lot of places, trying to find an opening or trying to find somebody who was taking patients in for an evaluation. Because Embrace Autism is located in Canada, my insurance would not cover the work that I was doing with Embrace Autism. 3 months later, started the process with Embrace Autism. I was able to afford, I was very lucky to be able to afford the first part of their evaluation out of pocket. Took all the information that they gave me at that time, brought that with me to the local psychiatrist that was going to do my evaluation, and brought that then to them. So that part of the evaluation, I delivered all of that information, the questionnaires, the tests, the essays, everything that I had done with Embrace Autism was also something this doctor was also going to look at and do with me. So for our time together, that cut down how much work that she needed to do with me because I'd already done that with Embrace Autism. So we then went through an initial questionnaire. We met 3 different times. The first time was a one-on-one session with a lengthy questionnaire where she asked me a number of questions of different things that, you know, sort of why I felt it was autism, why I felt it was ADHD, why I felt there were other things. I also wanted a test of OCD as well. So we went through that long conversation and I talked through a lot of lived experiences and where I was thinking and the things that I was reading and, you know, where I was seeing things that I related. The second session was in person and it was the beginning of a series of tests. So we started to do a series of tests. Because I am an adult in my 40s, I was asked if I wanted to have a friend, a partner, a spouse, a colleague, somebody who could also speak on my behalf, not in a validity sense, but a question of, they were given a questionnaire that was a breakdown of different questions that assess for autism and where people land about that person's observation of me. We both took the same questionnaire. I took the same questionnaire. It was a lengthy questionnaire about different circumstances, about how you see things, how you recognize things, how you interpret things, all these different questions. A very detailed questionnaire, and I found it really, really helpful where I could kind of be really honest with myself and be really honest with the psychiatrist as well. So my best friend, I gave it to them to take because this person knows me best. They've known me for over 20 years. Wildly surprised to see the differences in their answers for how they perceived me. This person who knows me better than anybody else in my life, how wildly different they perceived me versus what I was perceiving in myself. And it really showed to me how much I mask and just how vitally strong masking is for me, and just how much even the person who I am closest to in my life still doesn't necessarily see that full version of me because of how much I mask even in front of that individual who I'm so close to. I shared all of that with my psychiatrist who was doing the evaluation of me, and I was sort of very animated when I had that conversation. I was like, can you believe this? Oh my God, look at this. So that was a huge factor, and you know how I was able to speak to their responses and look at my own responses for the same question. So the psychiatrist also took those 2 things, and it was weighted as they did those 2 things. So then I came back in for another session. This session was quite long. It was a half day. They told me to eat a good breakfast beforehand, bring a bottle of water, bring snacks. I would take breaks throughout the day, but that I would be there for at least half a day, and that session was going to be quite taxing. During that process of that evaluation, there were a series of like mind game tests, like mental games, mental acuity games, questionnaires. There was like a computer exam where I had to like hit a space bar every time like a thing flashed on the screen, and it increased in speed the more I went. What I could not differentiate from was what was a test for ADHD and what was a test for autism. But what I can tell you is specifically there was a series of tests where I had to match the sound of someone's voice and pictures of people's faces, like moods and expressions and different things, and interpret, where I thought the facial expression matched the tone of the person's voice in the audio. I did not score very well on that. That is an area that I've struggled with. There was a series of tests like that. There was different like brain teaser things that I had to do, different brain teaser tests, or, there was like this little game thing where like get all these pieces over to this piece in this period of time. There were different time tests, which always give me tremendous anxiety. There was a lot of things where a lot of different questions would come up where I was constantly responding back with getting more context for this, and this. And, the answer was, we just have to pick one. You have to just pick an answer. You have to choose, well, what's the first thing that comes to mind? There were memory tests. There were things like long phone numbers, grocery lists, list of items of things that were listed in like a garage, or tell me, here's a picture of something. And then take the picture away. Can you remember all the different things that were in that picture? So cognitive tests and things like that. And then I had to like respond back with how many things of memory could I hold on to for short-term memory, long-term memory, different things like that. They also factored into how I was presenting myself, how I was in the dialogue and the face-to-face conversations, in the fidgeting, sitting still, all that different stuff. How much of that, the way I conducted myself in the moment of these tests was also accounted for in terms of the evaluation process. So that was the longest part of the process, was that evaluation. Finished that. They said, okay, that's it. You're done. It'll be a couple of months before we can kind of get back to you with the evaluation. The evaluation takes a really long time. I was told at that time that, again, this is just my experience, but I was told at that time that the evaluation process would go through the doctor who was doing the tests and diagnosing me would create essentially their case for why I did or didn't have ADHD, autism, and in that case OCD. And then they would then have to defend that to a different doctor. And then that doctor would review all of that research and all of that information. And then they would either confer or defer from that information. And so essentially it gets validated by a second doctor, a second medical professional. And so essentially when I, for this example, came out of this, and I did get my evaluation, and it was confirmed it was ADHD and autism. When I got that, it was confirmed by a second doctor based on all of the test results, all the research, all the things, all of this very deeply personal stuff, but also all of these tests that I did to put forward to demonstrate whether or not I have autism and ADHD. Then in my final meeting with the doctor who was evaluating me, he sat down and she went through her entire report. She walked me through every single stage of her findings, what her findings meant, why this, why not this, how this showed up, how that showed up, how these answers to these questions and what these tests did to give me that answer. And I have a full detailed report. And I actually reference this detailed report quite frequently. And I got an initial detailed report from Embrace Autism as well. And that initial report from Embrace Autism had very much confirmed most of what I was feeling and assuming at that point, but I needed to continue to get the official diagnosis. So that, along with this, gave me the official diagnosis. I still look at that report frequently. It helps me when I'm struggling with random things that I can't quite figure out, or as I continue to learn new things about myself or about autism or about ADHD. As I gain new knowledge, or I start questioning different things, I go back to that evaluation report frequently, and it was very easy to read. There were a lot of resources about where to go next, what to read afterwards. I, in fact, a year later went back to the evaluating psychiatrist after spending a year sitting with that evaluation and the diagnosis of autism and ADHD, and actually gave many more recommendations for reading suggestions and all these things, because obviously now it was a special interest. It continues to be a special interest, which is why I create content around ADHD and autism, especially in the workplace. And even now, as I go through the process of getting an accommodation for my workplace, I'm revisiting a lot of these things so that I can speak more specifically to the different accommodations that I need specifically in the workplace. A lengthy process. It took many months to go through. It took many months to get the evaluation. It took a few months to be on a waiting list and everything. That was the process for me as an adult getting my late diagnosis for autism, ADHD, and OCD.
Thanks for watching. If you found this information helpful, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Please also be sure to leave me a comment for a question or an area or a topic that you'd like to learn or hear more about. from ADHD and autism in the workplace, and I would be more than happy to make a video on those topics. And while you're here, be sure to check out some other videos on the channel. Here's some things that YouTube thinks you'd like to watch.